Okay. And we're recording, perfect. 44, we'll just wait a few more seconds. Get started.
And Haley is here as well to help.
All right, so we'll just start. Today and tomorrow we'll be going over these 4 elements: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, RESTful API, and GraphQL API. And these are all different concepts of web scraping. So I'd like to start this material with a short clip. Some of you might know. Every time you hear magic, I want you to think about web scraping, okay?
Welcome, welcome. We were just beginning. Please, stay and listen. So, as I was saying, the first thing to understand is that magic is, by its very nature, volatile and dangerous. Unless you can control it, it can and will destroy you.
Sir, I think we...
All right, so that's the first lessons from Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. And that applies to web scraping. You should first get in your head that web scraping is volatile and it's dangerous. So we need to have a truly mastery of it in order to, okay. So the way that I have structured it is that APIs will go tomorrow, and APIs stands for application. Here we go. Why not?
All understand that fairly.
No, not that one. I will just go to Wikipedia because it has really cool information. So the definition basically is an application programming interface. It's something that defines interaction between multiple software intermediaries. That means that it's software speaking to each other. And usually through web APIs, what we're doing is using some software to communicate and transfer data or requests, basically, between one entity and another. One API, for example, is your browser. Right now I'm using Chrome. And what that's doing is it's basically being powered by a kernel. It's sending requests to the internet, to a server, usually through GET request using the HTTP protocol, but it can use other protocols as well. So when you navigate to a website, what you're doing is sending a request for getting some connection and some data. So when I connect to this website, for example, for Wikipedia, what I'm actually getting is a document. If I go to page source, it's a document that's HTML5. And HTML is a markup language. That means that it's used to display some information. And in the current standard, basically what it creates is a document. And that document has the fields, the data, and it uses CSS in order to style it. So HTML gives you the actual data. And just a little bit on HTML, you have a head, which is something that goes before the actual content. For example, you can have meta, which are tags for the metadata. You have some other meta default or standard fields like a title. You can also have scripts. That means anything that executes, for example, fetching a document like a style sheet, or putting up or getting the JavaScript, which is something, it's a language in order to modify the content. And then you have the actual body, which is the content, all the way till the end, where the content ends and the document ends. So whenever we're looking at websites or web scraping, we usually deal with two kinds. There are more formats, but the most common ones are either HTML or JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object. Let's see, Wikipedia. Notation. And it's another standard. It's extremely common as a data type. And I believe mostly all APIs will have some support for JSON files. Okay. Any questions so far? This is just like a little preview of how the web works. We just need to know a little bit in order to understand what we are expecting or considering or interacting with. So one easy document to look at is email signature. So this here is my email signature. And we'll just go over it real quick. So it's an HTML5 document. Has some metadata like the author and viewport, etc. This style tag means this is the CSS. This is what actually styles the content. And it's important to understand that because a lot of web scraping will be based on these tags or the classes or identifiers, which are provided not by the content itself, but by the style sheet. Then we have the actual body. That's the actual content that we care about usually. And we have different entries or classes. For example, span, it's one of the HTML tags. You can have a class and you can also have identifiers. Usually a class is something that applies to many instances, while IDs are unique identifiers for that element, for that HTML element. Some of the most common tags or classes will be images and anchors. Anchors are links, basically, where you have some reference. For example, if I click on that, it will try to call my number. Or you might also have images and anchors together. So for example, if I click on that image, which is an image, it will redirect me to my GitHub account, which is over here. Okay. Any questions so far? Just a little overview about HTML, CSS. Can I get a hands up, hands down if any of this is familiar or if it is all new, just to get an idea. So let's do okay. Hands up is good. Okay. We have a few. Okay, perfect. Okay, it seems most of you are somewhat familiar. With a few exceptions. Perfect. Okay. Just a little overview. So what we'll do now, let me just take a look at the chat. I see there are two. Perfect. We're not gonna learn any shouts today, sorry. So now what we're going to do in the first part of web scraping, like the two classes, is we're just going to look at the type of documents that are called static. Static documents are basically anything that doesn't do, anything that doesn't have a server interaction, in the sense that the document static, it will not change based on inputs or anything like that. For example, it might change how, like the size of images or text, but maybe that doesn't affect what the actual data looks like. So one example of a static website or a page would be something like this. So this is just a GitHub repo. And if we look at, I'm using Chrome, you can use Firefox and has similar tools. But but I can right click and I can go to inspect. So if I go to inspect, what we have here is the actual HTML, like the page source. And when I click on an element like this one, we'll highlight it. And it says, this is an H1, that's a header of one, just the big one. It means like a title or something important. And basically we have a class, attributes, a reference. So this is an anchor, and then some text that's being displayed. We can also go over here and we see that when I created this file, we see, which is just a markdown file, it translated the markdown table to a representation in HTML. So this one here is a table that has a head, and we have TR. TR basically is the row, then TH are the basically what you would expect as the columns. So we have each of the rows and then each of the columns. So that's different from other representations that you have column-wise or whatnot. HTML tables usually have, or they will have it as rows, and then the elements are columns. So the TR is a row and the TD is a column. And inside that one, we have some element there. In this case, it's an anchor. And that anchor over here has an image. That's the one that's being shown. And it also has a source. For the image, has an alt. That means when it can't display that, it will give that text. And actually, if we click on it, or I don't have to click, I can just show there. Basically, it has a link to some other resource or path. I'm just gonna open that in a new tab. Okay. So what we will be doing today is going through an example. Right now, R is having some issues, not feeling well in Havana. So web scraping will likely happen either in Python or Julia until we can figure what's going on with the R version. So here, just taking advantage of the situation and showing you a little bit of Julia code here. So web scraping is one of those things that's pretty basic. So most languages will have this similar functionality and basically same components or functions and the same pipeline. So what you learn for one language will apply basically one-to-one mapping in any other, at least for web scraping. So what I'm doing here is I'm first downloading all my project dependencies and recompiling instantiation in the project. And I'm going to be calling these packages. So HTTP is basically a library to interact with HTTP protocol. That means everything that's get, push, post, delete, etc. In R, it's HTTR. We also have Kumbo, which is actually just a wrapper around the Kumbo C library. So it's a library written in C by Google that just parses HTML. So it takes an HTML document and it creates a document representation of it. We also have Cascadia, which is a CSS selector library in Julia. What that means is that we can take some HTML, we can create basically a way of selecting by CSS attributes. And then we can crawl the document and get elements that match our selection. Okay, and this is and the way that you can select based on CSS, that's documented many ways, but basically you can select by ID, by classes, by nested classes, by elements that match an attribute to the value or don't match that attribute value by order in a list. So there are many ways that you can make selections based on the style sheet. And lastly, today we'll go over WebDriver jail, which is basically an implementation of the WebDriver API. In R, you would likely use R Selenium, and in Python, I believe it's just Selenium. Okay. So, and JSON tree is just a JSON parser. So for JSON, R has, for example, JSON Lite, which would be like the R equivalent there. Full disclosure, I am the author and maintainer of the WebDriver package. So yeah, just putting that there. Not all self-promotion. So the first line here, what we'll be doing is getting a response. So we are creating an request, a GET request through the HTTP protocol to that URL. So this is the URL that we were seeing before. It's this one here. So when we're getting that request, we'll get this here. This representation is an HTTP message. So first, it will give you what the protocol is using. Here is HTTP 1.1, which is the current one. And it's giving you a status code. A status code is basically a shortcut or a simple way of specifying whether the request succeeded, was it doing what intended, or had an error that then you can look up, etc. So a status code 200, that's okay. That means that it's good. It will contain information about which server is interacting with, timestamp, the content type that's providing. In this case, it's giving you a text document, which is in HTML. And the character set is Unicode, UTF-8. Then it will have some header tags. That depends on the server, like what kind of protocol you're using. Okay. This is basically how the data is being transferred. So the way that data transfers occur during the HTTP and through the web is they're not giving you the text file. They're encoding that into different chunks of bytes. And then you interpret those after you get all the data. And here is a representation of the actual document. So we know it starts with HTML, that's an HTML5, has a head, has some, here it's just getting some resources and getting, I believe, yeah, some CSS. So that's a style sheet that's been hosted. And I believe that might be something else, okay? So as I mentioned, we should first look at the status code. This is a historical document, so we can go to the specification here. And this specification is by the W3C. Get familiar with that name. So whenever you see a W3C, that means it's a documentation or format that's being sponsored by the organization that basically is the authority on how things work on the internet. So for HTTP 1.1, we have basically a protocol that gives you what you need to do when you get something of that type. And then web drivers or like browsers and basically anyone that's using the protocol just has to adhere and implement that standard, okay? It's similar, for example, like Python is not a language, it's a standard, gives you a syntax, what you should expect, and then there's an actual implementation of that standard. For example, CPython, right? Same for like SQL, it's a language, it's a standard, it's not an implementation. Postgres would be the actual implementation of the standard. So here I'm just verifying that this response status is 200, because that's what I expect. And then what I'm doing here is I'm getting the body of the response, and I am interpreting that as a string. So it's taking all those bits and getting the string representation of that, so decoding that. And then I'm going to parse that as an HTML. In R, it's exactly the same. You would get the content of the body and interpret that, and like the encoding would be a string. So it's basically the same steps. Let's just take a look at that. Oh, by the way, if for those that are not familiar, I'm using the Jupyter Notebook. And of course, it just crashed. Well, wonderful. Some live coding here. I'll just run that. Okay. So after we have the HTML representation, what we want to do is get a way of selecting an element. And you can do that through basically three ways. You can use the document itself, and just go element by element, or the position. You can use the style sheet. Basically, you can select elements based on the style that they're using, like a class or an ID. Or you can use the XPath. Usually R recommends using these two. Whether one is better than the other, it really depends. Sometimes you can't do it with one and you have to use the other. Usually I suspect that most of the time using CSS is the preferred way. And it just makes it a little easier. So for example, that dot means, that's an ID if I'm not mistaken. Then this here means get the table. That's an element or is nested in that type or in that class. So I'm just gonna do that one. And then here I'm saying, give me all the matches for a table that's nested there in the HTML document. That gives all a list. So I'm just selecting the first one. So. Someone has their mic on. Get the HTML here. Oh yeah. To parse HTML here. So that gave me an element that's a table. As I mentioned, just as we did with the inspect method, it has a head, it has rows, it has elements, and then has multiple, that's for the head, for the table head, and then it has the table body, and it's the same thing. It has rows, has columns, and elements inside them. So the first element, and here what I'm doing is I'm using the position of the elements. So I'm going based on the DOM, and I'm getting the head here. If I do the second one, I'm getting the table's body. Okay. And you can see that this matches the section of the HTML that refers to that object. So if I wanted to get the first element of the body, or I can do that through the position. So I can say, from that element, give me the second one, which is the body, and then give me the first row, or the first element of the body, which is the first row. And I can just get that. Likewise, I can do the same thing and get the second row. Once I have that, in line 12 or cell 12, what I'm doing is I'm saying I want the second body, the second element of the table. That means the table's body. The first one, which is the first row. And the first row, I want the first column. And on that first column, I want the first value. And for that element, which I can just show here, that element is an anchor. And one of the attributes that it has is the href, basically the link. So I can just get the attribute for that element. Okay. So the way that what we have done right now is, just to recap, we made a response, or we got a response by by making a GET request. We inspect the message, look at the status code, for example. Then for the body, we get the string or decode that and parse the document as an HTML. We then created some query or something that we're gonna look inside the document. And we found some matches that met that selection criteria. After that, we started querying the element. And the way that we query it is by the position. So basically, we're just working with the DOM or the structure of the document. Once we have the element that we care about, then we can get the attribute. Okay. Any questions so far before I move to selecting with, oh yeah. And we use position, but we also use style sheet to make selections or to find elements. In R Selenium or other libraries, usually you call it find elements or find element that matches some selection criterion based on one of these three ways of selecting. Any questions so far? Does it seem okay? Everyone following? Let me take a look at the participants. Let's do yes, yeah, yes or no's.
Hi, Bayoán. I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
Can you specify the bracketed numbers again, like what the word, like what each one corresponds to for the structure of the HTML?
For this one here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the element that I'm getting, let's go over here. I am selecting it basically here. I'm selecting every table that's nested in the markdown document element in the HTML. And here I'm selecting the first one, in this case, just the unique one, because there's only one. But if I have multiple tables, then that just gives me a list of tables. So I'm selecting the first one. And this one, based documentation, continuous integration, that all seems to be this one here. So I know here that that's the table that I care about. Now, this table will have the first element is the head, the table head. That's basically this one here that has the column names, let's call it. The second element, it's the table's body, which is all the other cells. So if I wanted to get this one here, it would go get the table. This is the head, and I want the table body. So I can either do that through the style sheet or just through the DOM position. That would be the second one. And then for the table, second position or table's body, I want the first row, which is this one here. For the first row, I want the first column, which is this one here. And in the first column, I want the first element, which is this one here. I actually click on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure. And this is just by practice. Yeah, there isn't like magic way of, okay, perfect, I'm all good. But yeah, it's just practice. So I'm here, right? So let's say that I want to crawl a website. That means that I am getting some element and that gives me a link that I can then follow. That's a pretty common pipeline. So that's what I'm gonna do next. So I know some element here. Here I'm doing, give me a table's body, first row, second column, first element, right? So that would be this one here. Table's body, first row, second column, first element. And sometimes there are convenient ways. For example, RBest in R has a nice, just parse that HTML table and give me a data frame. For simple cases, it works. For anything that's not a trivial case, it's not a great way because many times there isn't a one-to-one mapping. So if you can verify that, then that's great. Otherwise, it will make your life really hard, especially for, let's say, tables in Wikipedia where you might have multiple rows or multiple elements in the same cell. So just watch out for that. So here, so for that element, what I'm getting is the attribute source. The source attribute is where, basically here is the anchor, and the first element, it's the image. So I can call it by doing nested image on that element, or I can just say, oh, that position. Either one works. And for that image, let me just show that one here. See, that's an HTML image, and the image has an attribute called source. That means where the image is being hosted or where it's being pulled from. So I know, for example, that image is basically a shield or a markdown shield. That's just an image that's linking to something that gets updated. So the image will change, or the values or the image that's being pulling depends on something else. And this is gonna be what will hint at APIs for the next time. So if I click on that, it's actually giving me the status badge for that CI. So if my CI, continuous integration, or my package was breaking, it would change from green passing to red failed, right? So this is one way of getting information about that status. Right now, because this is an image, I can't parse the text and say, oh, this is passing or not, because it's just an image. Unless I wanted to like put it into some image recognition and then like, but yeah, that seems way too hard for what we want. We'll go over passwords in a little bit. So what we're doing now is we're going to crawl the website, and we're going to next do a GET request to that URL. Let me just do that. So now we're going to a new page, and we're doing the same process. We get the HTML for that one. And what we see here, this is the actual image. It's encoded. But one thing that we can do is, so CVG is the image format. And that format, or that image, has the actual path or values, but it also has some fields that are used for creating the image. So for example, the CI name and the actual value that goes there. These are the actual colors. So here the color, whenever the status changes, it will change those values that are being served by the image. So here, all of that happens before I get the document, so I don't have to worry about that. I can just query the data directly there. So I could look at what this color is. Let's do color, that one, and say, okay, what's that color? Oh wait, that one is black. But one of those, I believe, maybe, yeah, that seems like, And this is just the hex code. Color picker, what's the color? Yeah, that one is white. Yeah, so one of those is green. I just don't remember which one, but that would be one way. The easy way would just be to get this value directly. So the way that we can do that is we go to the G element there, or this one here. I'm not sure what the G stands for, but that's okay because we don't need to know that. That's the powers of abstraction. You don't know how to, you don't need to know how a car works to drive it, right? It helps, but it's not necessary. What I'm doing here is I want to get the second child of that embedded element. So it's gonna look for that one, then it's gonna go one level deep to a child that's of that class, and then it's gonna go do the same thing, and then it's gonna find the second child. And then it's gonna find the text in the third child. Then it's gonna find the T-span. And that's the element that I care about, which is this one here. Okay. And just in case, I don't consider myself extremely good at this. So what I did to get that information is I used the inspector here. I inspect that element, look at the URL for the image, and then did the same thing of inspecting that element. And that's what it gave me. And then I just copy the CSS selector. I can just put it here. Let's see what that gave me. That's what gave me that. So it's not some, high level magic. It's just knowing how to use the tools at your disposal. The next part is once I have that element, what I want to get is the node text. So that's just a shortcut or useful function in order to get the text representation of that element. And that's what I wanted to test. And then now I know, okay, this one here has passing, so I know the CI, it's passing all my tests for that package. If I wanted to get some, let's say, I first want to get the element and then I want to know something about the element, I can also look at the attributes. So for example, here it's saying that that element is being horizontally centered. There's a line centered. So you can also get other information once you have HTML element that you have selected. And that basically is a simple way of using HTML and CSS to work with static files. Let me just double check how we're doing on time. Perfect, because the web scraping might take a little longer. Any questions so far? No? And if you want to try, I'll email everyone with a few data camp tutorials, and if you want to look at the RVest what's that, vignette, you can do that. Let's do that. It's really short, but that's good. Selector got the, yeah. Basically, it goes through the same process of getting a document, using the inspector or selector gadget. I believe that's might be Chrome, Firefox. Finding the elements that you care about, and then using the same thing. So here with RVest, you read the HTML from a website, you look up the nodes or the elements based on some selector. The default is CSS. So that's what's doing here. It's looking at that element. These are nested. So TD is a row, or a column, and then the anchor, so that means the link. So that would be that one, Batman. Basically HTML tags is the same way of saying get the node text. Yeah, so it's pretty similar across different languages. You can also crawl the internet by getting an href, which is what we did, and then getting the URLs to do the same process again. Can you get it to return a whole list of things rather? Yes. And for example, let's just do that. Let's just do this. So if I were to do rows, and the selector is just, let's do TD. So if I were to run that, yeah, this should be self. What it's giving me is every element that matches that. So in this case, in this document, there are 38 elements. There are columns. So that means every column in every row in every table. So you get them as a list. Okay. So if we're good on that, let's see. Perfect. Yeah. What we'll do now is look at when you can't use this method. So basically, we have different ways of accessing information from the web. And these are mostly focused at HTML documents or JSON. Like, for example, you can download a PDF and then convert it to text and then do the analysis on the text. That's fine. But here we're focusing on resources that are HTML or using like JSON or some information. So the preferred way is APIs by far. And that's what we're going to focus tomorrow. If there isn't an API, or for some reason you can't use the API, then your second best would be to use something scraping the HTML and CSS. So that should be your second approach. If none of those two work, then we'll go to the third level, which is using a WebDriver. So that should be a last resort. And the way, or one of the reasons why you might not be able to use it is because it's having JavaScript. So someone on the chat mentioned passwords. So right now I'm gonna show. So I have two examples. One is this one here, where you have some interactive elements to it. So for example, if I were, well, it's a single record. These are test that, websites that you can use in order to test your code. So I will put, I'll give you the link to these two so you can like play with it. It's fair use. So a lot of what's scraping, and I'll go into that at the end of today, is about being a good net citizen and respecting the terms and agreements when you're interacting with a website or service. So these are fine because they're actually meant to be used for people learning or testing stuff. So if I were to use a test username, let's do Nosfreakin, and then for my password 1234, save. Perfect. So what happened there? What happened is I put something there, and we can actually go and look at the page source. And we see that here we have Nosfreakin here. If we go to the page source, you will see Nosfreakin here, right? So that seems fine. And if that's what we care about, then we can just use that, the process that we just learned about. But what if you had to make a query? For example, US Library of Congress, copyright records. And this is for an actual project that we had. Let's say that I want to search copyright records. And I'm going to look for data. I have a bunch of documents here. And let's say that I want to get the records, let's say copyright number, the date, and the title. So if I just care about these, then that would be fine. I can just actually just get this table because it's nicely formatted. That's great. But maybe I need to get the next page. And what you see here is the URL to get that page. It's not something that's completely related to information that I have a priori. So I can look at the URL now here, but I have no way of constructing it for the next one. So if I were to click on that, inspect, this here gives me the URL for the next one. If I click on that, then that gives me that. In some cases, you might not even have that. So one way that you could do this is to get that first URL, get the next link, and do that many, many times. But if you wanted to actually go ahead and also change or interact with that, then go back, do a different search, etc., there might be a complication where something needs to happen, some input. You need to send an information here. For example, I need to send some keyword in order to get the response. For example, that part there. And that, the only way that I would be able to do it is to actually do it by hand. And that would be not great. And that's not ideal. So that's when we need to have a way of interacting with the JavaScript. Okay. Does that make sense for the people that have questions about passwords and whatnot? So this is one example where you actually need to do some clicking and some interact with like different elements in order to get the source that we care about. Because right now, if I look at the page source, there's nothing here that I can use. Actually, what this is doing, it's running that script in JavaScript in their servers. So I really need to interact through that portal, sending some information in a way that's automated in order to get back the results that I care about. And that's where web drivers come in. And web drivers, here we go, are a W3C specification. That means that all modern browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Opera, Safari, Edge, all adhere to this API. And when I say API, I mean it's literally an API where like a common one is just a REST API. So for example, if you want to tell your browser to open a new session, it's literally just sending some information. And we'll learn how to do that tomorrow. But I just wanted to highlight that even your browser, it's relying on an API in order to do everything. So when you open a new tab, when you navigate to a new page, when you click back, when you refresh the page, everything that's going on the browser level is just an API that's getting some information, executing something, and then giving it back. So what I'll do is, let's see if this works. There we go. So let me just share my screen again. And now I am selecting this one. Perfect. So this is the test suite for the WebDriver package, and it's using the pages that I just mentioned before, these ones here. So what I'm gonna be doing is, oh wait, sharing is paused, resume sharing. How do we do that? Okay, let me try again. There we go. Is that working? Can people see my screen now? Yes. No? Anyone tell me? Oh, wait.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna assume it's the right one, which is this one here. Let's see. Can you all see me type?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to start Julia here. I'm using Visual Studio. Like getting it to work with Ribbon requires the VPN, so you probably don't need it. Our studio is great for R. But if you're using some of this and Jupyter doesn't work, there are other alternatives. I believe Ribbon has Atom, for example. So using is basically library. It's just calling the code. Oh, I need to make sure that I have Docker running, which probably is here. Yeah, perfect. So what I'm doing here is I am making a connection to a Docker container that has the standalone from Selenium. So Selenium is an implementation of the WebDriver. It's the most common one. And that's what many web developers use in order to test their pages. But because it's basically the same facilities of automated browser, which is a WebDriver, then we can use it in order to web scrape. So what this actually does in the backend, same with our Selenium and same for the Python one, is you have some container, which is basically a server that's handling all the requests and doing everything for you. And you're just using an API to interact with it. And then the basically our Selenium or the Selenium for Python or WebDriver are just a wrapper around that API, so an interface that allows you to do stuff easily. So I'm going to pass the capabilities. That would be browser name in R. That just means I want a Chrome browser. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating a remote WebDriver. I believe in our Selenium it would be a remote driver. Yeah. And I'm passing the host and the port, which is linking to my Docker container. And we have one set up in Ruban as well. So for a new session, that's what I'm gonna do. Wait, no, what I just said. I really believe that I did not change anything here in the code. Let's look at this. That's a session. That's a remote WebDriver. No method of post. Oh, I know. I did change something. Okay. Let me just go here 1 second. I'm going to whatever. I'm going to discard all changes. So, or let me, yeah. gonna record all changes so I can run the tutorial. Sorry about that. Discord change. This is what happens when you're working with your Git repository. You haven't changed anything yet, or you haven't committed that yet. That's okay. I'll fix it eventually. Okay. So yeah, hopefully that gives us back to where we were. So let's just go back to the test suite. Do this again. Might have to precompile. So what we're going to be doing is, or the interesting part, we're going to put something in the username, put it something in the password, then we're going to click on save. And we're going to verify that the information here changed. This is just rendering different values. For this one here, we're going to play a little bit. Oh, wait. You won't be able to see it because I'm changing the screens. Yeah, that's not great. So let me share the screen here so you can see that. Okay, so for this one here, we're gonna click on the radio. We can change this and click on that. Here, what we have is it's printing out some text. We can delete that, verify that this button works. I have been added with a timeout. We can click on that and it will open a new tab. So you can play with the website. Has quite a few features that you can test. This one, I believe it's just that. Also has the link. It will give you a pop-out. We can dismiss or accept. So these are all defined in the protocol. So let me go back to the one that I wanted to share. Any questions so far or comments? You can write in the chat as well. Just want to make sure. Have any of you worked with web scraping before? Or have you any of y'all used a WebDriver before? Let me look at the participants. No, I see 1 no, 4 no's. Okay, so most of you haven't used it. It's a quite neat skill to have. This works as I intend. Seems to be working in session. Ooh la la. Yes. Okay, I remember why I changed that code. It's because I'm using the new version of Selenium. Okay, we'll be doing web scraping primarily in R, Julia, or Python. It depends on the project. Hopefully you won't be needing to do web scraping. And they will, well, hopefully you will be using an API. That's what I would recommend. Yeah, probably an API. Those are a lot easier. So that's what I would recommend doing. If you do need to use web scraping, you can use any. Right now, R is not working in Rivana, so it might just be Python or Julia, but we might get that fixed next week maybe. So I'll just go over this since I should have made sure that that works. So I might have that for tomorrow. What would be an example of an API? Let me see how we're doing on time. We have enough here. Okay, perfect. What I might do is I might start a little bit with the APIs, and then tomorrow I'll just circle back once I downgrade my Docker container to make sure. But the idea of a WebDriver is it's basically the same way of using the HTML, CSS selector. It's just that you're sending keys or making actions. So for example, I'll just do something like this. You can select an element. This element type here is the one that has a select type. So in this chapter 1, select type. I need to share the screen. Okay. Google Chrome. Yes. So let's go to chapter 1, this one here. So if I wanted to select that one, I can go to inspect. I see type radio, which is one of the types, and has an ID. So I can say, give me the element that has ID equals radio bottom, and it will give you this element. And then once you have this element, you can send basically the action of click. And what it will do is it will click that for you. Same way here, you can select, say, this field here. And that one is class below center, ID HTML5 div. So you can select that element and then send keys. And by sending keys, it's basically typing. So you can see here that it has nothing here. And as I type, you will see that this will be updating. So that's the difference between a static and a dynamic site. In a static, that would not change. In something, this changes because it's using JavaScript. So the server is running and updating the values. Let me see the shot here. Yes, exactly. Yes, and you should definitely use APIs. Let's, I'll show just a little preview of the APIs that we'll be using tomorrow. Because for tomorrow, one of the homeworks will be to get a GitHub personal access token. So for example, one API that I have been using, or that we use in our research, is the COVID-19 tracking project. So this is a REST API. And if I wanted to get, let's say, all the values for testing in a state or something like that, let's see, historic values for all states, I can just do a GET request to that, and that will give me the full data in JSON. So that's a simple API. You just pass a GET request. What you get back instead of being HTML is a JSON, and then you can just parse it. So that's an example of an API. That's a lot easier than going and doing all the web scraping. But if you look at the COVID-19 project, the way that they build their data is by using Selenium and HTML and web scraping each of the states' websites, because the states don't have an API, or last I checked, none of them did. So I think maybe the CDC might have one. So one of the ways that they do it is they create a web scraper for each of those websites using the same tools that we learn. They collect that information, they put it in a Google spreadsheet, database, CSV files, and then build a server API in order to provide that data. The one that we'll be working with for tomorrow is the GitHub one. So let's just do that now. Yeah, while I work on that. So, and there are also, let me just do one more API example. This is gonna be quite trivial, so we'll not use those for tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll focus on GitHub, but this would be a good one. So the Arlington County Open Data Portal. We have also used this website and their API for some of the projects. So those that are using state or local government, you might have a data catalog for those. Let me just go over here. Data.Arlington, Virginia. Yes. Yes. Let's go and do 50. So you see why easier. So there are different data set. Here we're going to be looking at police incident log.
Here, you're able to search, sort, and view data sets searched by county and not.
So this one here has data for like police incident logs since 2015 for the Arlington County Police Department. Let's see if that loads. You'll get metadata in different files. Yeah, you can even embed it in your website. You can download it directly, just clicking on it. That. Or you can get it based on an API query. Okay, that's taking way too long. I don't know why. Likewise, you can also get maps, for example. So S3, ArcGIS, or the ArcGIS portal, you can get maps in geo format. So for example, let's look at one over here. I believe it might be this one. So with that, you can download the map directly by just basically downloading the file. That's one of the methods that I haven't talked about. Yeah, it's actual documentation. But you can download a file from the internet directly. And that's basically using an API. It might, depending on like how the format is structured. Okay. So let's pause for 5 minutes. And what I'll have you all do is create a personal access token in GitHub for tomorrow, because we'll be playing with the GitHub REST API and GraphQL API. So everyone has a GitHub account right now. So what I would like you all to do is to go to GitHub. I'll show the process here. Go to GitHub, go to settings after you have logged in. And go to developer settings. After that, you will be clicking, doesn't matter what device we do it? No, you can do it from your phone, doesn't matter. It's not, it doesn't have to do anything with the device. Where is the dev setting? Let me just go back one. So here I am, github.com settings profile. And actually I can just give you the link directly. So if you go here, let me just post it. You can just log in there. We'll be using it for tomorrow. So personal access tokens are just a kind of token that can be used instead of a password over for Git over HTTPS. It's one of the ways that we can authenticate to the API. So we're gonna go on generate new token. Here you can say, for example, DSPG. And for that, what we would like is let's see, let's do repo. Let's do read org and user. I think that should be good, yeah, for this stuff that we're going to be using tomorrow. So that would be repo, read org, and user. Let's put it here. And then we just click generate token. You will get something like this. You just need to copy it and keep it safe somewhere like LastPass or whatnot here. Since I'm recording and showing it to all of you, I'm just gonna delete it, but basically just copy it and keep it safe because we'll be using it tomorrow. I'll give folks 4 minutes, like 12:20, just to finish setting up the their personal access token. No, it doesn't matter. It's just something for you to know what the token is for, or to basically know the application, or in this case, it can be like DSPG. No, like once you have created it, don't delete it. I just deleted it because I shown you the value to everyone. So, but just keep one. So in the end, you should have something like under tokens, you should have the name that you had it and then the scope. Let me just show that. So for example, here I have one all GH-OSS, which is the one that I use for the OSS project, as the public repo, read or read user, those. And I have COVID-19, which I have used for COVID-19 related project. So I can show the code. I'll probably just go over it tomorrow quickly, just to show you the results. But here I'm just gonna preview it since I need to update something while I was working on it. So some of the functions, and Jeff probably shown you the documentation first, but I use navigate to basically switch from one URL to the other. So that would be basically putting a new URL in the browser. At any point, you can query what's the current URL once you're in like a website. You can go back, you can go forward, and you can refresh the web page. Each web page will have a document title. That's the one that we learned from the meta tag. We also, I will skip some of these. Let's do some Windows. You probably don't know too much about that. What I will say is there are some websites that have different frames. When you're doing using a WebDriver, you need to know that the elements might not be searchable if you're in a different frame. So that's something to consider. This is mostly checking like the dimensions. That's mostly used for testing UI, not actual scraping. And here we are, like the most relevant section, which is when we want to interact with elements. So we can query whether an element is active. We can select an element. And this is similar to what we were doing with HTML and CSS. We can select multiple elements. That means we can select every element that has a select type, for example. And this syntax here is XPath. So you can use same CSS, XPath, and in some cases, vendor-specific commands, like Selenium will have a few. Those are being deprecated because now it's a web standard, the W3C, or the World Consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium. There we go. So you can use XPath or CSS, doesn't matter. Once you have an element, so for example, this one here, I'm selecting different elements. And you can, for example, get an attribute like the value. So it's the same idea and same steps that we were using for static websites. The only difference is the values are not static. So we need to use the WebDriver in order to be able to always have access to the updated HTML. That's the only difference, other than like you're actually sending values. So you can get element properties, like the value, and you can get CSS or style sheet values for that. So this element, the select type, and the font size, it's this value here. So 13.323 pixels. Many times what we care about is the text. So you can call element text on an element that you have selected, especially when the element changes. So that's something interesting there. You can get the element tag. And we can also send and interact with the document. So for example, here I'm selecting the radio button, which is this one here. And notice that I'm using the same selectors that are valid with static websites. And here I'm checking whether it has been checked or not. So right now it hasn't been checked, so I can just click that button. When I click it, what I'm doing is updating the property check to make it true. That's why the radio button had like a check or not. It's just displaying that value, whether it's, that property of the element. For example, on the website, I couldn't uncheck that value. Like with user interaction through the browser, you cannot uncheck it. But with a WebDriver, you can, because you can go ahead and modify the attribute directly. I believe with the inspector, you might be able to change that as well. So this one here was the text box. So, which is what I mentioned, that had the ID HTML5 div. So the element text, so I can get what the text of the box was. And with the command clear, I can just delete all the text that was in that box. So here what I'm checking is that the new text value for that box is actually empty. I can also send keys or write in that text box. So in this version of this package that I'm working with, I haven't had much time. So right now, what you can do is send text. But in the full API WebDriver support, you can send keys such as I'm gonna shift, or I'm gonna press down the shift button, then type 3.5, and then up the shift. So you can do basically everything that's supported by the keyboard or keys. But here I'm just sending the text, which is what most people do. Right. After I have sent that to the text box, we can verify that the text box text has changed. So the element for that, or the text for that element. One thing that it's useful is sometimes you don't want to go through all of this, or you already have some code that will take a page and work as if it was static. So nice thing about a WebDriver is you can always get the source or the HTML values or that version at that moment in time after you have interacted with it. So if I were to click on or change or send some key to the text box, that will update the HTML, and then I can just get the HTML document updated at that time and then treat it as static. It's the same way with our Selenium, I believe it's just HTML or a page source, if I'm not mistaken. You can also execute JavaScript directly. So this is a bit more advanced, and you probably don't need it. This is mostly for people that are testing the user interface. But you can actually execute JavaScript commands on the web page. So for example, I can make a script where I change the value. This is basically just clicking, but I'm doing that through JavaScript, and I can do the same thing, and I can verify that. You can also handle cookies. The cookies are caches for that session. So for example, a website might not let you go on unless you have a cookie with a value or something like that. So if that's the case, or a CAPTCHA that shows up, usually you shouldn't try to avoid CAPTCHAs because they're a way of stopping automated crawlers and all that, but that's one way, all seem for use. So you can add cookies or delete cookies, and you can also hover over elements. So maybe when you hover over elements, something gets displayed, like the counts of like, let's say, crime in one neighborhood or in one block. Maybe you just want to get that value. So you can move the mouse to that element, get the pop-up, and then get the value from the pop-up. So that's something that probably don't need, but it's just good to know. Sometimes you will get alerts or messages that might be something, oh, are you sure that you want to click here? Then that's one way of not bypassing, but interacting with those pop-ups so you can actually keep working. So if you're scraping a website and every time that you click, it will say, are you sure that you want to use these values? Then that's one way that you can interact with the pop-up or with the alert. Yeah, so you can, as I mentioned, you can move the mouse by pixels, or you can move them from one element to the other. You can click different elements. So here, it's the same way of getting an element, which is the bottom, and then just clicking on it. And lastly, as I mentioned, we have frames. So sometimes you need to change the frame first and then look at the HTML for it or the elements in that frame. So every time that you're working with our developing a scraper, you should look and practice first using the web browser. So let me just double check here. Let me share my screen. Okay, y'all can see my screen, right? Yes. So as I mentioned, this one here, I can add in an attribute. And I believe, let's see if this works. That didn't work. Okay, I'm not sure about that one. But if you're clicking something or hovering, okay, this is open a new tab. So that's something that will show us a pop-up. So you can look at that, interact with that pop-up, the text, all of that. I believe, let's see, which one is it? It might be the other one. There's one of the examples that I had, which had a, let's see if it's this one. Nope. That I had now I can't remember. Okay, I know something that might work. Let's go to GitHub, which is the website that I use the most. Okay. If I go to GitHub, let's do food copy tracking. So I don't know if you'll notice, but when the site was loading, here it said fetching contributors. And I can show the same thing here. So if I click on that, it says loading contributions, and then it's executing some code first. So let's assume that I wanted to get these values, which is the summary of all the commits that I have done and the lines added and deleted. If I just go and get the query here from static HTML, I would get the first version of the page source. So let's do that. It took too long. Let me try that again. So what I have done is, before the page loaded completely, I try to save it. That will stop the interaction with the server. So what I get is the code at that time. So I don't know if you'll have seen those blogs, but basically a lot of websites like news articles, they will have, you start reading the article and then a pop-up says, oh, you need to subscribe to actually read this. So I'm not saying that you should, but if you just click and save quickly before that pop-up, you actually get the full HTML at that point before the pop-up, so you can read the full article for free by bypassing that. So that's just showing how when you're getting the query, if it's a JavaScript or a dynamic website, you will not get the full HTML values at the end after it has computed. So if you wanted to do that, you would need to use a WebDriver. You couldn't use the HTML at that point. But if you were to use a WebDriver, just wait a few seconds and then verify that this has loaded completely. Then you can just save the page source and just treat it as a static and do the same thing of, okay, I want to inspect that value, look at the span, text, screen, everything like that, and get the value. So does that make sense? Yes. Anyone? You can put it in the chat. Yes, no. Why static? Okay, perfect. All right. So for this one here, so this is just a preview for, I believe we're running out, right? We have, and do we have what, 15 minutes? Yeah. So I'll just preview a little bit for tomorrow. Sorry about the WebDriver, not live coding it, just because I forgot to update the Docker container there. So here what I'm doing is setting up some base URL. And this part here, what you see here, you might not be familiar with this. This is GraphQL syntax up to here. So GraphQL syntax is basically a language. I believe it's here incomplete if I'm not mistaken, but it's not meant to be a programming language. It's just a language in order to specify or interact with GraphQL APIs. That's what we'll be learning tomorrow with using the GitHub one. Let me just show. And over here, yes, we'll also be looking at REST APIs. So REST APIs are those that basically just use get, push, put, HTTP protocols, and then based on the URL there, and if it's a post, they put like some JSON payload, and then you get something back. The GraphQL API, it's similar, but it always uses post, and you pass a query or some text in the GraphQL language with some additional JSON files to complete that query. I'm gonna stop here because I think that's quite a bit. I want to use the last 5 minutes to say something about the ethical implications of web scraping. So for APIs, as we'll cover tomorrow, they usually have a rate limit, and they have policies against abuse. So we'll go over how to understand those policies, how to comply with them, how to respect, how to use best practices, not to abuse it. For example, many cases, and we have had this few years back, if you're gonna query some files, then you probably want to just save that and then work with it later. Other, like, compared to just crawling that every single time. Because if the values are not going to change and you might need to query it and you need to have a safe copy of that, just query it once, save it, and then work locally on that just to reduce traffic to that API. So I'll do one example of something that happened to me actually with the US Copyright Office. So this website here is doable if the servers are working during the time period that we wanted. To get the data, the servers were really bad. So it would crash all the time, but that was like on their end, so we couldn't do anything there. So before you start looking at web scraping a website, let's say, try to look for others that have already scripted and may have copies there. That's good practice. So for example, US copyright records. I did that search. And I found this link. I believe it's this one, which said that other people had already posted some versions of those. Public, yeah, that one wasn't working, but it was basically from publicresource.org. So I found this website, and they say that at some point, it was archived, they had a full list of, or basically a project, right, to get an API for the dataset. Basically, they were saying, we have a web-based application, which is not great for bulk access. Same, for example, like state legislative records, like how your state or how Senate's or House representatives vote. That's sometimes they just have a faxed image of the voting for that measure. That's not machine readable. It's hard to conduct research on that. Sometimes they will provide as PDFs and you have to convert it to text and parse it. Sometimes they will have a Flash app, which is just obsolete technology. Just makes it really hard to get access to that kind of information. So this guy, for a moment, he sent a request to those people to, hey, can we have like an API or something that's better? The person that responded basically said, we don't have any plans to do that, but you're more than free to scrape it. So you can, there are no limitations on downloading and harvesting your records from bulk or individually. So that means, okay, we're good. No permissions needed. However, if it is just for load and just to have good performance on the servers, try to do it at night. That's basically what they ask. And if it's gonna be quite a bit, can you just notify this person? This is from dozens. So that's something that you can do in order to identify. There we go. So that's one way of making sure that what you're doing complies with whatever is being provided, especially when it's a resource that's shared by others. For example, like government websites, but it also applies to companies. When I emailed the person to see whether they had that data set, the emails were not kind at all. So you might have some people that, you know, they might not be the most polite person when you ask for, hey, do you still happen to have that data which you thought you had? Just, but even if that's the case, you should make sure that you have exhausted all other alternatives like APIs or other alternative sources in order to make sure that if you need to do a web scraping, it is absolutely necessary or is worthwhile. So just make sure that you're in compliance with all terms of agreements, that you can use the data afterwards, that you're not going to impact business as usual for that website or that resource, and that you have, for example, make sure that there isn't like an FTP server or something that would be a preferred way of accessing the data. Okay. Any final questions or comments on if you have had web scraping experience before, anything that you have liked to know ahead of time? And the projects that actually require web scraping, you can let us know and we'll help you set up. Anyone? All good? I'll check the participants. If you're all good, then you can do the yes. Okay. Seems like it's quite good. Okay. Okay. I'm happy with those 17 folks that answer yes. Okay. If you don't have any questions, I think will yield the remaining of my time, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. I'll go over the GitHub API. If you do have an API that you would like to get a bit more information on, or you might be using for your projects, let me know, and I might be able to incorporate for tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll do the GitHub API fully because I believe it's one of the best documented and powerful APIs out there for the public to use without any restrictions. For example, yeah. So I just think it's great for learning and practicing. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Aaron, you have anything else to add?